This week, we discuss the problem that is the Food for Peace Modernization Act. We revisit the Saudi Arabia issue with new details, and we answer questions from our fans. I'm Christian Ray alongside Stephen DeLogalis and Elijah Mori, and this is the Team Policy Podcast. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions along with Stephen and Elijah, like how do we record an episode? How do we get it onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify or all those platforms that everyone's always talking about? And the answer to every one of these questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing your podcast. Best of all, it's 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with great sponsors who want to advertise on your podcast. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that's what I'm doing right now by reading this ad. Guys, in our experience with Anchor, we're pretty new to it, but it's really been fantastic. We have started off, we have gotten our podcast already admitted onto platforms, and really the best part is that Anchor is doing all the work for us. We just signed up, we gave them our information and our files that we wanted uploaded, and they did all the rest for us. It's super easy, and they'll even pay you to get started. I can't say enough, guys. If you want to get started with podcasting, go to anchor.fm/start. Again, that's anchor.fm/start. That is not that's not .com, that's not .org. That's anchor.fm/start. Check it out today. We can't wait to hear what you've done with this awesome podcasting platform. Check it out, guys, and let us know.
Good morning, fellow Americans, or wherever you may be
Mikey?
listening from. My name is Steven, and I have been here a while, so I'm not sure why I'm introducing myself. But I get the pleasure of starting and talking about the Food for Peace Modernization Act. If y'all haven't heard about this case inside of the STOA/CCFSE League, well, you are in for a treat, because no other case have I hated more than this one. So what is it? Well, it's one of your generic boring cases talking about food shipment, basically, or how we dispense U.S. aid supplies, specifically food aid supplies, throughout the world. I absolutely hate these cases because they're extraordinarily boring. But in more detail, currently there's a Food for Peace program, right? That program just gives generic ways and procedures for which food is dispensed. For example, your aid agencies are required to monetize a certain percentage of their aid. They're also required to ship 75% of aid directly from the U.S. and just little stuff like that. But the Food for Peace Modernization Act is a modernization program which is desperately needed because this program is very outdated. So what the Food for Peace Modernization Act does is three things total. First, it abolishes monetization, which is basically a practice of which aid organizations, let's say in Kenya, are required to sell 15% of the aid that they have at dirt cheap prices. The problem with this is quite often it really hurts local farmers, and this especially is a very good example of what happened in Haiti, where if you sell food at a dirt cheap price, the poor farmers down there aren't able to compete with that dirt cheap price because they're selling food for a living. Next thing it does is lowers requirements that 75% of food aid be shipped from the U.S. to 25%. What this basically means is this is quite heavily lobbied to keep like this, but whenever we ship food down there, we're required to buy 75% of that food inside of the U.S. or buy and ship, which this is actually, if you're going negative, a pretty good argument spot because it also means if there's such a market where U.S. farmers are having to make all this food to sell, it makes quite a supply. And this modernization bill moves it down to 25%, meaning now we have the liberty of buying 75% of all of our aid in other countries if deemed cheaper / better. And the last thing it does is it allows us to increase the use of LRP, local and regional procurement, to 75% instead of the 10% where it currently is. If you don't know what that is, basically we're required to ship 90% of all of our food aid in-kind food aid is what it's called. But basically we actually put that big solid bag of flour onto a boat and then ship that boat to a random country and offload that boat. Local regional procurement, or LRP instead, is we send them the money and we don't actually send them the supply. So then aid organizations down in a random country like Kenya, I guess I'm just going to keep using Kenya, would be able to buy the food directly from Kenya. And that would not only help the Kenyan economy, but it's because we don't have to worry about paying for administrative costs, and we don't have to worry about paying for shippers to do that, and we don't have to worry about paying for a random guy to move the stuff from harbor to boat. And instead we just ship the money or give them cash vouchers and they can buy it directly in those countries. So that's basically what it does. It's a much needed modernization act. And the issue with that is all the benefits, which affirmative teams have a tendency to be obnoxious and really say this a lot, is their advantages are, one, it saves 40,000 children's lives, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And the second advantage is you can feed 9 million more people per year, or up to 9 million more people per year, which is two pretty dang healthy advantages. But as my favorite Coach Vance once said, there's no such thing as a perfect case, only a perfect debate team. Luckily, I am definitely neither. So there are ways to attack this. Christian and I have done a lot of research on this, and not going to lie, this is a pretty solid case. But we've found that the best ways to attack the Food for Peace Modernization Act, or for short FFPMA, is generic food aid bad arguments. Okay, those, if you buy any subscriptions such as Ethos or Blue Book or Impact Debate Coaching, our favorite one, you can see a lot of food aid bad stuff. And my favorite under these arguments would probably have to be, one, food aid increases terrorism, and two, food aid destroys the economy in the long run, which is honestly the main way that you have to attack this. Basically saying that, sure, we might help a few lives today, we might help a few lives tomorrow, but over an extended period of time, with such increased aid, in the long run, you're going to harm the world and you're going to harm the people. And there's a lot of random disadvantage on this, such as dependency, or such as hurts local farmers, hurts U.S. farmers. Stuff like that is probably your best way to go. If y'all out there, all you listeners, have other really good points that you'd like to share with us, we would absolutely love this. If you would want to DM us on Instagram or shoot us an email, that would be absolutely fabulous. Hey, Christian, what's our email again?
Just teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's teampolicypodcast@gmail.com.
Heck yeah, it is. So if you want to shoot us an email there, that would be pretty great. And any thoughts on this, Eli or Christian? I think I'm about done with my spiel.
Christian, you will go first?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't want to be a broken record, but this case, it's good in a sense. We hate it because it's unoriginal, and one annoying thing we saw was almost, I won't say almost every team, but a lot of teams at a recent tournament we went to, a lot of them were running this case. So every other round, just about, we went against this case, or not even necessarily Food for Peace Modernization Act, but just the number of food aid cases out there. There's a lot. So I'm just going to, I guess, to differentiate from what Steven said, I'm going to add some random thoughts about food aid cases in general. So there's, of course, the the arguments, generic arguments against food aid. There's generic arguments about how they harm farmers, things like that. If you have a monument membership, there's a brief that has a counter plan to address this. I won't go into details and take away from any of their content. If you don't pay for that, I suggest getting it and checking it out. But they have something really good on this. What I would say, though, is run generic stuff. run as many disadvantages as possible, but really just try to do stuff like that against FPMA, and then against other cases like LRP or against CPFA, you have more flexibility. So against CPFA, really quickly, I would actually run a topicality press. Why would I do this? Well,
that's good.
This case has been run, I heard, 5 out of the past 6 resolutions. It's been considered topical in some way or another. Don't ask me how. I can tell you under transportation, CPFA is actually under the DOT. It's not under USAID. USAID only administers like the types of aid that are used. They're delivered through that mechanism. DOT actually sets the regulations. So technically that's transportation policy. And if you, again, have monument memberships, and if you have some of your files from last year, you might be able to dig up some stuff talking about that. And I suggest looking into that. Against the LRP, you could go after some arguments like flexibility. You could go after just the overall issue of there is, forcing just one mechanism is just as bad as what we're currently doing, which is forcing one mechanism, except it just is bad for different reasons. So all the problems we have now, we'll still have problems. They'll just be different problems if you force only one means. So FPMA gets around this by flexibility, but if it's not FPMA, you have more approaches you can take. If it is FPMA, I'd say take the generic route and maybe get a little creative. But I agree with Stephen. We'd love to hear any different arguments or anything that's outside the box to get this. Elijah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, speaking of outside the box, I went up against this case at the recent tournament. I didn't win. The team that we went up against, they actually went up to finals. They were really good. I had no idea what to do with this. I don't think I had any. Let me see. I think I had some generic stuff, and then in the 1NR, I started talking a lot about institutional bias. And if you want to look at institutional bias and how that works, I would recommend Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's big league economics professor. Just search that on YouTube. And basically the idea is that institutions have their own biases as to what that come before anything else. And I went through that argument, and that giving these organizations more freedom and more options could be detrimental because they will serve their institutional biases, and particularly monetization. I believe that when the team argued against us, it wasn't that you abolish monetization, it was that you allow there to be no restrictions on monetization, which was or minimums or quotas on monetization. So my argument was that these institutions may, like an NGO, Oxfam, whoever's getting this money, they might just decide to monetize all their food because they need the cash, or they might monetize none of the food to the detriment of the people. The idea was that there's institutional bias, and that can skew things because people do what's best for themselves before anyone else. That's an original argument, but it didn't work. So you can try that if you would like to. I don't think I wouldn't recommend it especially. I didn't have any cards with me. I was just remembering an interview I watched the previous day, and I was like, I think I'll apply this. And that's what I did.
Nice. Good deal. So the issue with this case is they have some pretty dang significant advantages, and it's kind of hard to convince a judge not to save the lives of 40,000 children.
Right.
Just logically speaking. But if you do figure out how to beat it, give us a shout out because we'd love to hear your strategy. And hey, we probably actually will even ask you to be a guest speaker on our podcast. That'd be pretty dope. So definitely shoot us an email, drop us a DM. And I believe now Christian has a pretty interesting next segment.
absolutely. So, I'll just go ahead and say this was something that we put out a poll recently on Instagram asking people, what do you want us to talk about, or what's a question for us that you have? And someone asked, someone didn't even ask a question, they just entered Saudi Arabia case. I was like, okay, well, you asked and we delivered. So this is interesting. I was talking to somebody, I won't say their name, but they are a nationally ranked, one of the top TPers in the country, probably top 20, 30, something like that. I haven't checked their rank as of this year, but they were at Night Talk last year, and they were definitely a power team, one of the debaters on them. And this case is the Saudi Arabia case that we're talking about. I was actually talking to this debater about it and some interesting arguments with it. So, first of all, so a little bit about the case. Let me start off with that. For this case, teams that are running it, they may get a little varied on the details, but generally what they're going to argue is that we need to end arms sales and or military aid to Saudi Arabia and or / the war in Yemen. Long story short, what they're trying to get at is forgive me while I gather my thoughts a little bit here. What they're trying to get at is we want to pull out of the war in Yemen because it's causing a humanitarian crisis and it's harming lots of civilian casualties, basically. So there's lots of people that are getting caught up in this war who are women, children, who are affected by blockades. They're affected by airstrikes. They're not able to get food. So it's a big deal. It's a big problem. The UN declared something like the largest humanitarian crisis since the UN's creation recently over this whole situation. I won't go on about it too much because I think that most people are familiar with this. But long story short, the Saudi Arabia case would try to address this by pulling the United States out of the mix and trying to get the war to end. It would do that by stopping support for Saudi Arabia, either through arms agreements and or military aid. That being said, what are some problems with this case? So first of all, in recent months, I'll say, as of about December 13th, there was actually, I believe, a peace agreement of sorts settled or agreed upon. This is from Julie Hirschfield Davis and Eric Schmidt in December 13th, 2018, writing for the New York Times. Quote, in late October, Mr. Mattis and Mr. Pompeo had called for a ceasefire in Yemen, and on Thursday, talks that were brokered by the United Nations and Sweden appeared to reach an agreement to ease the hostilities. The agreement calls for an exchange of up to 15,000 prisoners, the creation of a humanitarian corridor into the city of Taiz, and importantly, the withdrawal of troops from Hudaydah. Forgive me, this is an interesting name for the city. No offense to any Yemenis that might be listening to this. But anyway, what this is talking about, long story short, is that there were peace talks that were brokered by the United Nations and Sweden, and they came to agreement that's sort of a ceasefire or a step down from where they're currently at. And long story short, this is a big inherency problem for affirmative teams. This is a big inherency problem for affirmative teams because in order to, first of all, even begin to argue about why we need to do something right now and why this is a big problem, they have to show that this problem is not going away. And this is specifically talking about how the problem is getting solved right now, how the war is sort of coming to a ceasefire, how hostilities are coming to a pause, how we are ending the fighting, and how we are, beyond that, we are actually setting up sort of safe zones for civilians. That's a really big deal. One of the big basic premises of this case is the emotional argument for it. So the argument that we have women and children that are primarily affected by this. And this is really specifically addressing that. It's addressing the fact that we are currently taking steps towards fixing the problem. I believe in an earlier episode of the podcast, we talked about how the U.S. Senate actually basically rebuked Saudi Arabia following the killing of a journalist and over the whole war in Yemen and cut off military aid. So I won't go too much into that, but inherency information, some new information here that I don't remember if we covered or not on an older episode, but we had a lot of people asking for this, so I want to bring it back up. Is there is some form of a peace negotiation in process and a peace settlement, basically. So the situation appears to be winding down. If you have more recent information on that, we'd love to hear it, but that's a big deal for inherency. Other things, just really quickly on this case that I don't like. Topicality. This is a big stretch, this case, because in terms of aid, we don't really give a lot of aid to Saudi Arabia. They're an oil-rich country. They don't need aid. What they want are weapons. They want things that they can buy from us. So on that note, most of the basis of these cases deals with cutting off arms sales. Now, we have to answer the question of, do arms sales count as aid? If they are paying money for it, and we're getting something in return for it, like tangibly in return for it, not something like we give them something and then they maybe do something for us, but like they're actually paying us money for this transaction. Is that actually a form of aid, or is that a sale? Personally, I think that's a sale, and I think it's going to be really hard-pressed on affirmative teams to support that. I think teams that win with this will win it off of the emotional arguments of helping women and children or something, but not off the actual basis of meeting the stock issues, meeting the voting issues, showing that how this is foreign aid. Note that this is not under the foreign aid budget. This is arms sales have to be approved by Congress, I believe, but these are actual business transactions that are taking place between U.S. arms companies and the Saudi Arabian government. So the only military or government involvement on the United States end is through Congress just approving arms sales. Which, speaking of which, with the hostilities in the political atmosphere in the United States towards Saudi Arabia right now, it's unlikely that a lot of those arms sales are going to continue to get approved if this keeps up. Lastly, let's just talk about solvency and some disadvantages real fast. So the solvency aspect of this, I think, is pretty straightforward. Basically, you have multiple countries involved. So even if the United States gets out, we still have we won't necessarily cause Saudi Arabia to stop. They could just buy their weapons from someone else or keep going with what they're doing. Beyond that, some of the weapons we are selling them are actually precision-guided weapons, which means that they are designed to reduce the number of civilian casualties, the unintended deaths. So the U.S. pulling out isn't necessarily going to do anything. Other than that, you have actors like the United Arab Emirates, you have Iran, and you have other coalition forces, most of which I believe have stepped back, but you still have the main actors there. So until that changes, the United States pulling out won't necessarily do any good, and it might actually open the way for leverage for other groups or actors to step in to fill the void, such as Russia or China. So all those would be serious problems. So disadvantages, we could hurt our ally, Saudi Arabia. We could lead to more civilian deaths by failing to provide precision weapons, which would actually reduce the number of civilian deaths. We could hurt American businesses and jobs by blocking arms sales. We could support mutual enemies, so enemies like Iran, who are involved in this conflict. We could give way to Russia and China to gain influence, and ultimately we could just make the whole situation worse. So while this case may be out of good spirits, it's not necessarily it's one of those cases that you do because it makes you feel good. It's not necessarily a case that you do because it's actually going to make the situation better. So that's something that if I were negative against this case, I would seriously harp on. That's sort of how I feel about this. I don't like the case. I think it's a case that, if anything, if it were passed in reality, it wouldn't necessarily make things better. But it's a case that does seem to be winning. I know it's a popular case out west in the United States right now. So if anyone is listening to this and planning to go to Nighthawk, you definitely need to be strongly briefed against this. That's kind of my rant on it. Do you guys have anything to add quickly before we kind of wrap this up?
I think that was really good. I have to confess I'm not very familiar with the case, but just that in general, that was very good to know.
Elijah, do you have any thoughts on sort of the geopolitical involvements here?
Again, just like Stephen, I'm not familiar with this case. I don't think I've experienced it at all. I'd probably say, like, objectively, it's an arms sale, not foreign aid. So that's probably the I mean, for any judge, I feel like for any good judge, if you convey it well, they're automatically gonna lose on topicality because it's not foreign aid.
Right.
Are the arms sales even subsidized in any way?
I don't know. They could be, but technically, if they were, so if they were using FMF or foreign military financing, where basically we give them a rain check to buy military equipment, where we foot the bill, but they can buy whatever they want, and then they use that to buy military equipment, that would be foreign aid. That would be military aid. But if you look at the numbers for their aid under the USAID website, they receive basically zero aid. I think it was a total of like $700,000 last year. So the aid that they get that's actually classified as aid and not where they actually buy something is next to nothing.
Yeah, I think that case is probably just knocked out of the water from just that. That's my opinion anyway.
Right. The only thing I would add to that, I know I've been talking for a long time about this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the only thing I would add to that is be careful if you're running against this case on topicality. While it's true that you must emphasize that it is non-topical, be careful because teams are going to really twist this and make it sound like it's topical, and don't just assume that because you said it's non-topical that the judge will buy it. Really paint the difference between what is a sale or what is a mutually beneficial transaction and what is aid, where we just give something with no return. So there's that, and then really I would say try to harp on the fact that we could potentially make the situation worse by stepping out of it than by being involved, albeit from a distance. It's a case that, last remark, it's a case that will sound very good and it will sound very justifiable whenever the affirmative reads it. But when you get into the details, it might not be as much. So those are my thoughts on it. And I will leave that there. Okay. Now that we have that out of the way, really quickly, guys, we have some questions. So we put out a poll, like I said, on Instagram, and we have some things. We have 3 questions from our audience that we're going to be answering today. So, Steven, I think this first one's for you.
Good deal. Some pretty cool guy named Austin asked us, how are you guys preparing for the next tournament? I'll tell you, Austin, it is very much preparation. I would honestly say that debate, for me at least, has to be about 80% preparation and 20% execution, in the sense that I've been probably spending 2 to 5 hours almost every day the last 2 weeks, except for maybe 1 or 2 days a week, just researching debate, trying to do a lot of organization, because, what's the point of having a really, really good negative brief if you don't know where it is or how to use it? So a lot of organization, a lot of research, and a lot of kind of planning. Christian and I have been on a couple of long phone calls this week. We're just kind of been deciding what's going to be our execution process if we go up against Food for Peace Modernization Act, or if we go up against Ebola in Congo, or some strange case like that. So we're just kind of figuring it out. We have to-do lists are amazing, especially if you have little dots that you can press that will give a little check mark to make you happy. And yeah, so a lot of research, a lot of organization, a lot of Jesus, and just that sort of stuff.
Awesome. And then I think Elijah has the next question.
Okay, from Matthew. Matthew asks, who is actually behind the overhead.stoa Instagram account? Now, I had no idea what this was before I looked on Instagram, and overheard.stoa, this account is run by somebody in the Stoa League, obviously, but what they do is they hear quotes from other people, and then they write them down and put it on Instagram, and they're all like funny debating quotes. One person said, "I have social skills. Have you met me?" Or Austin, the same Austin from, I believe, the earlier question, he said, "If Ebola breaks out in Vegas, does it stay in Vegas?"
That's a pretty
These
good
are
one.
just like funny quotes from normal sleep deprived debaters. I don't know who runs it, unfortunately. Like, you could probably, from all the people that are quoted here, and all in like the regions that are mentioned, like it mentions that a TP debater from Georgia, so and so, in some of them. So you could, if you wanted to get really specific, you could write out on a pinboard, put all the papers up, and figure out the location and the name of this person by looking at registries.
That's a little extreme.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. But if anybody wants to do that and figure out who the mystery overheard .stoa is, please send us the information and we can put it on. Well, I guess maybe we shouldn't release their identity.
I don't know. Watch this is like some parent or something who's like not even debating. They're just like making fun of all these things they hear their kids say. That would be funny. Okay, so last but not least, Don says Saudi Arabia case. Like I mentioned this earlier. This is my comment. Well, that's not really a question, but okay, you asked and we delivered. So we actually, fun fact, real quick, we had a lot of people asking us about the Saudi Arabia case. What are our positions on it? Do we have some feedback on it? And try to refer people to an earlier episode. I think we've gotten a lot of new people who aren't really willing to necessarily listen through all of our old episodes and try to find it, which is totally understandable because we're still figuring all this out, and some of our episodes are a little long, which is why we're actually shortening this for you guys. But that's really we wanted to provide a little bit more of that for you guys. So okay, and anyway, guys, that's it for today. Other last good news, really quickly before we leave.
We are drum roll to this little part.
Yeah,
we got uploaded not only, so we're currently on YouTube, right? Well, we just got our podcast uploaded to Spotify, and we're almost up on Apple Podcasts.
Now, if you look on Spotify right this second, it probably won't be up yet. I'm guessing they have to wait a few days to load it, but it's on its way.
We probably also won't upload this for a few days, so.
Yeah, it'll probably take a little while. We're still getting set up on all that, guys, so stay with us. If you follow us on Instagram, you saw my little rant about that, about just delays with that. But anyway, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you all soon.
Bye, guys. Bye.